What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Behind the Facade. I'm your host, Gavin J. Gallagher, and on this podcast, I explore the mental and emotional game often playing out subconsciously, both in your mind and the mind of everyone else in the real estate or property investment market. The key to success in this game is to master your mindset and behavior, to take control of your thoughts, your emotions, and most importantly, your ego. Welcome to the show. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode. And this week, I'm going to be coming back to the HMO Investing in Ireland series. If you remember, a couple of weeks back now, I did the part one of this. And part one was, I think it was episode 213. So at this stage, 9 episodes back. And in that episode, I went through, what is the HMO, the definition of a HMO. I went through some of the differences between them. I went into, the benefits for the tenant and landlord, and I went into some of the challenges for people that are looking to do this themselves. But, there's a lot of people interested. I've been getting a lot of interest in social media whenever I talk about it. So I'm coming back to it today, and I want to go through it. And the intention here is that these 2 podcasts that I've done at this stage will be converted into a HMO training that I'll put available free to all of you guys if you want to drop in and watch that. And I'll put all of the best kind of insights and tips and strategies and stuff like that all into a single training that you can get in one place. It'll be a little bit sort of more condensed than this podcast, where it's a bit more chatty and things like that. But anyway, let's get into it. First of all, one of the things that I'm not sure, I can't recall whether I talked about this in part 1, but I've seen before a couple of times people asking, like, what's a HMO compared with a pre-63, and what's a HMO compared with a bedsit, because they're all similar in definition if you actually speak about them. And so quickly, I'll just sort of explain that if you're looking at, or if you're talking about a pre-63, typically what a pre-63 means is that it was in use in multiple, like as a multiple occupancy, before the planning regulations were introduced in 1963. And so if you've got a place that has been used as a house place or a house share or whatever, split into different rooms and into different accommodation units and things like that, if that's been in place since pre-63, then it's before the planning came in and before the regulations came in and all that kind of stuff. And that means that whatever's there can continue to be used like that. It doesn't need planning per se. Now, the bedsit, this is an interesting one, because if you look at the description of a bedsit, it does sound quite similar to the description of an individual unit in a HMO, but they are kind of different. And it's important to this because if you go back to 2013, bedsits were effectively banned from being used or being rented to people back in 2013. And it actually had been flagged for a period of about 5 years before that. And what had actually happened was, if you go back to 2008, the building regulations, or specifically the housing regulations, the standards for rented houses came in 2008. And in those regulations, they spelled out that by 2013, so within a 5-year period, the following will not be permitted. And it basically stated that every single rental unit had to have its own separate sanitary facilities, and it had to have adequate heating, ventilation, and cooking facilities. Now, the reason that this is important is if you go back and look at the way bedsits were, like for those of you who are younger and they don't know specifically what I'm talking about when I say bedsit, a bedsit was typically a bedroom and a sitting room and your cooking facilities all bunched together in a single room. You didn't have separation. You basically got out of bed and you were standing at your kitchen sink. And so it was really very, very basic accommodation. And it was often, pretty poor, and it was like the lowest rung of the property ladder. If you're living at home with your parents and you want to move out, the easiest option, the cheapest option would have been, first of all, to go to a bedsit, and people would have used them perhaps when they were getting into college or something like that. And often what was happening in this bedsit is that the rooms would be split up, and there would be a shared toilet. So it was pretty pretty kind of poor usage. You'd be talking about maybe 5 or 6 people all living in their own little rooms, and then they'd all be going and sharing a toilet down the hall. And so these were considered to be, substandard conditions for anyone to be asked to live in, and therefore they were banned in 2013. And ironically, now looking at the situation that we're in this country, that was a mistake. You should never have banned those, because whereas when they were introduced in 2013, like that gap between 2008 and 2013, that was the height of the recession. And there was already falls in rental values. There wasn't enough people renting. Like there was an oversupply in the market of property. And so there was falling demand for rental accommodation and stuff. And so this was a way for the government to kind of like boost the rental supply. And as it turns out, though, it was a bit of an own goal, because if you go forward now to today, all of those bedsits would have been perfectly good for people like the housing crisis that we're in. There'd be lots and lots of people that are homeless now that would have maybe been able to afford a really rudimentary bedsit, but they cannot afford to go and rent a standard accommodation unit. And so that's some of the stuff that I kind of wanted to cover, the difference between the bedsit, the HMO, and the pre-63. And when we're talking about a HMO, what a HMO essentially is a house share. If you put your house on the market, let's say you have a 4-bedroom house somewhere, and you decide, you know what, I want to rent it out, I want to travel the world, I want to rent my property out. You have a couple of options open to you. You can find a family that want to rent the property, and you give it to them, and they'll pay you whatever, 2.5, 3 grand a month. Or you can go and you can rent it to, say, a student, and the student will say, I'll pay you the 2.5, 3 grand a month, but I'm going to be sharing it with my friends. So they'll all chip in, and we'll end up, making up the rent that way. And that was a house share. The exact same amount of rent paid to the landlord, and it was up to the tenants between themselves to work it out. Like, one tenant would probably sign the lease, and the other lads, he'd be chasing them to go, come on, you owe me 500 to go and pay the rent or whatever. The other issue with that, though, was that tenant, that first person that came in the door, the student, we'll say the master tenant, he would come in and he would have to sign up to the phone bill, he'd have to sign up to the electricity bill, he'd have to sign up to all these things in his personal name. And then it would be up to him to chase the others to go and chip in. So there's a lot of hassle with that. Whereas with a HMO, the landlord takes on all that hassle. And he just says, look, there's a room, you want the room, it's 800 a month. There you go, take it or leave it. And when you get the room, that's all you have to pay. Now, sometimes you will have an additional utility fee. Maybe it's €50 a month or something, and you have to chip that in as well. And that is to cover the bills and things like that. But that's generally how the HMO works. It is effectively a house share, but instead of paying the master tenant, you're paying the landlord. And so that's kind of where it all falls in. So let's get into the next thing. I mean, in part 2 of this podcast, what I want to cover is the regulatory outlook, because as far as I'm concerned, that is probably the big risk, and it's the area that a lot of people are probably should be worried about, if anything, because it's not currently regulated. If you go and look at the HMO market in the UK, it has been regulated for a number of years, and it's just a fact of life over there. If you want to go and do HMOs, sometimes you need planning permission, sometimes you need licensing. There's all sorts of different rules around it. Here in Ireland, there is no regulation at all, none whatsoever. And so you have this situation where there is a risk, and the risk is that you go out there and you're looking at property to buy, and you're thinking about it as an investment, and you're thinking about it not as a standard house rental, a buy-to-let, where you'd be getting 2.5 grand a month or whatever. You're now thinking about it as a HMO, and you're saying, if I turn this into an HMO, I could be getting 5 grand a month. And that might be your way of thinking, and you might be saying to yourself, okay, this make the yield, if I'm earning 5 grand a month, that's 60 grand a year. The yield on that is XYZ. And so there's a risk that you could overpay for the property because you are applying a yield that is based on HMO usage. But if regulatory changes were to come about and they were to force you to stop using it as a HMO and revert back to the previous usage, then there's a good chance that you have overpaid because your yield is going to substantially fall, or it's going to be substantially worse than it was when it comes to your income and your amount and the amount you paid for the property. So Why would you be forced to convert back? Well, that is where this whole regulation sort of question comes into it. And in the case of bedsits, that's exactly what I'm kind of referring to, is that bedsits, there was a reason that bedsits were deemed to be unsuited, and there was this period where they're going to be removed from the market. And I sometimes consider, what are the risks of the government coming along and saying, you know what, HMOs are not acceptable, and so we're going to remove them as well. Now, that I think is unlikely, but I do think that there are other things that could be introduced around HMOs that would introduce some friction in the whole thing. And so it's important to look at that. And the best place to look at, if you're thinking about regulation, the best place to look is the UK, because the UK is regulated, and as has been done before, the Irish will always will tend to take a look at the UK market. They'll have a look at what they've done over there. They'll have a look at the regulations in place, and they might borrow some of the regulations, or just as they did with the building regulations back in 1989, they'll just take the building regulations and just put a harp on the front cover and say, these are now the Irish regulations. And so let's have a look at some of the things that the HMO regulations introduce. First of all, a HMO is any property with 5 or more occupants from different households living under the same roof. And in the case of that, it must be licensed. And one of the problems with licensing is that they restrict the number of HMOs licensed in a certain area. So there would be parts of the UK, we'll say, where there might be a road, and somebody said, you know what, this is great for HMOs. And suddenly all the houses are being converted into HMOs. And so you end up with 10 on a road of 10 houses. And that's the kind of thing that the UK regulations wanted to prevent. And so they would put in a restriction, and they would say that only X number of HMOs are permitted. And so it's first come, first serve. You know, the first person to go in and get the license, he's okay, but then the next person that comes along, they might be okay, and then after that, maybe you're not allowed to do any further. So that's something to think about. The other thing is there are minimum room sizes inside of the HMO regulations in the UK. And so in a room that's designed for a single person, the minimum size is 6.1 meters per squared. Meters, basically, for the room, square meters. In the case of a couple sharing a room, the minimum dimensions for that room is 10.22 meters squared. And so this is important because a lot of the time people will rent out their rooms and they won't have done anything to the rooms. They are just the standard rooms the way the house are. And anyone who's familiar with a typical kind of family home here in Ireland, and I mean typical as in a 3-bed semi, you will go up the stairs and there will be your master bedroom with its ensuite, then there'll be a toilet, and then there'll be 2 bedrooms. That would be the typical layout. And one of the bedrooms will be a decent size and the other one will be akin to what we call the box room. And that would usually be located where the stairs is coming up. And so some of the room is taken up by this kind of slanted floor where the actual staircase is coming up through the floors. And so that room becomes smaller. A lot of the time people will build a wardrobe kind of over that slanted area. And so it ends up with quite a small amount of space. And that might not fit within your regulations if they were to be brought in. And you might have a situation where 6.5 meters, you cannot achieve that. And therefore that room no longer can be converted or turned into a room inside the HMO. Now, another thing is amenities, and by that they mean the numbers of kitchens, the numbers of fridges, the area for kind of seating and relaxing and things like that, maybe an outdoor space, whatever it might be. The number of appliances is probably the biggest one, and over a certain size, you're supposed to have 2 fridges, you're supposed to have 2 cookers, and so on. And I think that is probably good management anyway, because a lot of the time, if you've got like an 8-bed HMO, the usage is pretty intense, and so it's likely that the cooker would break down sooner. You'll also have friction between the housemates, insofar as if somebody is cooking at 6 p.m, that means nobody else can cook at 6 p.m, and so it's kind of pushing everyone to use it later, or else they start sharing the cooking times. Now, what would trigger the introduction of regulations? That's anyone's guess, but usually there's something happening in the market that causes it to either become a pressing thing in the news, or it's some sort of complaint, or maybe there's some sort of like bad news that comes out and it highlights, like a slumlord or something like that taking advantage of people. And so what is likely to happen is that so many people start looking at this HMO option that it becomes sort of rampant, and you have HMOs everywhere. And in that situation, you'll start to have complaints from families looking to rent and they're not able to find anywhere. And then there's an investigation into it, and they'll find that all the houses in the area are HMOs now, and there's no family houses left. And suddenly, okay, we got to go and restrict HMOs. And so how are we going to do that? Another thing is, the more people that enter into the sector, the more you're going to have a range of standards. Now, the guys that I'm working with in my accelerator, some of them are doing this, and they're doing it at a really high professional level. Like the finishes are beautiful, houses are finished to a very high standard and all that. Compare that with somebody who's kind of a bit of a cowboy who just comes in, like all the furniture is all old, curtains are sitting there for years and years, and you're effectively moving into kind of like a bit of a slumlord situation. And when you have that kind of range, all it takes is for somebody to go and post something on social media and say, is this, acceptable? ? And they show a photograph of a rundown, nasty looking place. And suddenly that'll become, something in the news. The next minute the media are talking about it. And next minute the politicians are being asked to react to it. And they'll say, no, this is completely unacceptable. And you're going to get tarnished with the same brush. Even though you might be one of the professional guys that's doing a beautiful job, you're still a HMO owner, and therefore you're kind of like lumped in with the guys that are cowboys and that are doing a crappy job. So what's likely to happen? Well, I would say if regulations do come in, what's likely to happen is room sizes are going to be stipulated. And so if you're doing HMOs, what you should be doing is, at least at the very minimum, aware of the room sizes of every room in your portfolio. So in the event that something was to change, how many of your rooms are impacted. That's the first thing. The next thing is, should you preemptively be looking at this? Maybe you should be actually looking to increase the size of those rooms. Now, there might be a bit of work in that, but it might be worth doing that preemptively rather than waiting for this thing to happen down the road. The next thing that is very likely to be introduced is enhanced safety standards. And so fire safety is the first thing. If you're in a standard 3-bed, buy-to-let, the likelihood is that there is a smoke detector at the top of the landing, and it's going to be one where you put in the 9-volt battery and you test it every now and then. And the reality is a lot of people, they don't have the discipline to test it, and so nobody's checked it for a long time, and maybe it doesn't even work. The way it will be introduced is most likely hardwired proper fire alarm system, where every single room, like the house that I'm now living in, every single room has got its own hardwired smoke detector, and it's all wired back downstairs to a central kind of monitoring area. And that is the standards that are likely to be brought in. Another thing is, every room should have a fire door, and like a typical fire door it's just a big heavy door, and usually it'll have like something like along the lines of a 1-hour fire rating or a 30-minute fire rating. And it just means if somebody's phone charger went on fire and the bed covers went on fire, as soon as you run out of that room, the fire might be raging in the house, but it won't spread to the other rooms because the door will keep it at bay. And that's an important thing. And so how you know if you've got them is just the weight of them. Like at my house now, every single door that is into a bedroom and stuff is a fire door. And I know because the kids find it very difficult to open them because they have door closers, and the doors automatically close after you leave the room. And because of that, you either wedge them open with a stopper or they're always closed. And my son, Dominic, like the 4-year-old, he finds it actually quite heavy. The doors are almost too heavy for him to open, so it takes all his effort to open the door and to get through it. Whereas the bathroom doors, they don't have fire doors, and so those doors just swing very, very easily. They're much, much lighter. That's a big difference in terms of your fire safety, and there's a bit of a cost in that as well. But it is going to save somebody's life potentially in the event of a fire. And if you've got multiple people living there, chances are the fire will rage in one room. It won't spread before the fire brigade are there putting it out. So you at least might save your house. And then various improvements to the amenities, like increasing the number of fridges and freezers and whatever. Another thing that's likely to happen is inspections will start to take place, and you will have people who are aware, the local authority will be aware that a place is being used as a HMO, and they'll knock on the door and they'll say, hello, I'm here for the inspection, and they'll walk around the house looking for anything that is breaking the rules. And they will have probably some sort of right to shut the place down or to issue some sort of enforcement notice and say, you've got 30 days to rectify this. And if you don't do it, then you're going to have your license will be removed, or you'll be closed down, or whatever it might be. And then also management regulations will probably come in, and that will be around waste management, because everyone's thrown all their rubbish into the bins and stuff like that. How is that being managed? Who's collecting the bins? The other thing is parking. One of the big issues I see with HMO, when people are looking to site a HMO, they'll go into maybe a cul-de-sac, we'll say. And if they go down to the end of the cul-de-sac and they have a look and they say, oh, here's a nice house that will turn into a 6-bed HMO. And the problem is if you're renting out without thinking about this, you could have 6 people all driving cars, all trying to fit their car into this small cul-de-sac. And what you'll do is piss off every single other occupant on that cul-de-sac, because most houses are built to have the car in the driveway, and then you'll have, maybe if you have a second car, it'll be parked out in the street. And so in the evenings, those streets tend to be quite full of cars. And along you come and introduce 6 more, and you're not going to be popular. Maintenance, cleaning, various standards, like how often is the house cleaned by the landlord's sort of cleaner or something like that, that may creep in as well. How do you future-proof your HMO so that you don't get caught by this? Well, obviously, I've just informed you of some of the regulations. Like, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm just guessing that this will come in at some stage. It might be another couple of years away. It might be introduced next month. Like, you really just don't know. And so it's a good idea, if you're doing up a house, then if you're about to start a project, then it would be worth your while speaking to somebody about the UK regulations, and just say, you know what, let's have a look at this from that kind of frame of mind, and think to ourselves, if we're going to do this, let's at least try to future-proof it so that the sizes of the rooms and stuff have been considered in advance. And if you're approaching it from a professional way, then that kind of makes sense. Another thing, in terms of management of if you're going to future-proof this, one of the things that's really attractive about HMO investment is that the rent is much, much higher than a standard rental. And so, using the example, you could be getting 2.5 to 3 grand. But if you're doing good HMO, rented out to multiple people, and maybe you've extended it as well, you could be getting 6-7 grand a month from the same property, but being converted into multiple units. And so you've got this a lot of extra cash flow. And a lot of people will think to themselves, whoa, this is great, like I've got like this cash cow now. And of course, there's a lot of ways you can spend that money. You can either plow it all into paying down your debt, which is probably wise enough. You could decide to upgrade your lifestyle. That's another way people will often do it. And another thing might be that you start plowing it into other investments, and you say, okay, I'm going to take this surplus cash, I'm going to start buying something else and build up a stockpile of cash to go and put into the next deal. But probably the wisest thing to do would be to build what's known as a sinking fund. And that is where just every month, if you're getting 7 grand, we'll say, a month coming in from your tenants, maybe put £1 grand aside into a bank account, and it just sits there. And that is your bank account for possible work that has to be done in the future if regulation comes in. So that you don't have a situation where you're scrambling to find money. If you've got a portfolio with multiple properties, and you've been chipping away £1,000 a month into each property's sinking fund, then you could have, collectively between let's say you have 10 houses. Collectively, you could have, 150, 200 grand sitting in all of those bank accounts for the different houses. And so now you've actually got money to go out and implement some of these changes that might be needed. And I mean, it's really, it depends how long you've been chipping in. If it was to happen suddenly, then you're out of luck. But if this was, say, 3 years away and you're chipping, a grand a month away, you're going to have 36 grand sitting in the bank account there. Multiply that by 10 properties, that's 360 grand sitting there. So that would go a long way to at least upgrading your properties, if that was what. And that's the purpose of that money. It's there for that unknown day in the future. So look, let's talk about how do we maximize those all-important returns and get the profitability of the HMO investment up. There's a lot of different ways to do this as well. And as I was talking about earlier, the different approaches, like you've got the amateur approach and you've got the professional approach. And if you want to kind of go down the road of getting extra money, probably the best thing to do is start with a premium offering. Instead of just doing the standard house with, where it's got the master ensuite and stuff, and then it's got the 2 bedrooms, and you're going to have this thing where it's very obvious that somebody who's renting the room, the master bedroom, will say, maybe it's a couple, they live in the master bedroom, but they also have the ensuite. Like, they're getting the cream of the crop, they're getting the best room in the house. And then the other person who gets the second bedroom, they've got to share the bathroom with whoever gets the box room. And whoever gets the box room is obviously well aware that they've got the most substandard room in the house. And that doesn't feel great. When you're trying to rent out a property, you're going to immediately have people wanting the master bedroom. You're not going to have anyone wanting the box room, and they'll kind of take it begrudgingly. One of the options that I've seen and my clients have gone down the road of is where you convert all of the rooms on the top floor into the same size room, each with ensuite. And so now there's more work involved, but it ends up with a much more superior product. And so you're taking down all the stud partitions and you're making 4 rooms, all the same size, each then with a cluster of en-suites that are against a wall, we'll say. And you can do these en-suites they're kind of little octagonal shaped things, and they go in the corner, and you can fit a shower and a toilet and a sink, very, very small, but it fits in and it gives you your own space. And that makes a big difference to somebody who's looking for space. They know that all the rooms are the same, and they know that each of them has the same facilities. And so straight away, you're able to get equal money for each of the rooms. And it also looks kind of premium, as opposed to having to share a toilet and stuff like that. You actually can go out there and you can look for premium rate. And it just makes you look a little bit more professional, I think, as well as a landlord. Also, little touches can make a difference. Good bed linen, pillows, mattresses. I went around, when I moved to the UK for a while, I remember going around with my wife and we were looking at the different properties available. And we looked at the first one and it was an absolute dive. I mean, it was just rotten. The curtains, these where the curtain rail, some of the things are missing. So the thing is kind of hanging down in places. The light would be coming through in the morning. Like, that's not the way to present a property. You look at the bed and it's a kind of manky looking mattress that's been there for years. Instantly turned off, like walking out the door. Don't even need to see anything more. You go into the kitchen and it's got kind of creaky cabinets, and it's got kind of the signs of years of usage where there's kind of wear and tear on the kitchen and stuff. Like, all of that just makes the place look like it's a rundown sort of piece of shit. And so you just don't want to rent that. We went and looked at, I think, 6 properties that day, and we were going up and down stairs and everything like that. And then we came to the final one, which is funny how it was the final one that the agent showed us. And obviously that was her strategy, is keep the best one to last in case I was to choose one of the crappy ones instead. And we looked at them all, and then the final one, walked in and instantly in love with this place. It was a new fit out, really stylish. All the furniture was new. The beds were new. Mattresses were new. They had puffed up pillows. They had lovely white kind of bed sheets. The whole bed was made and everything like that. Had art on the walls. New kitchen. And I just remember looking at Ilga and the two of us just nodding like, this is the one. No further decision required. And that was it, like instant decision. Whereas the other ones, it was like, oh my God, is this the best that we can do? And so that was a really insightful moment for me, because it suddenly made me realize the value of just putting a little bit of effort into how you present the property. Now, services like high-speed Wi-Fi, that'll obviously help as well. cleaner? Whether do you provide like a cleaning service where a lady will come in and mop the floors and the common areas and do that kind of stuff? And maybe for a few extra quid, you can have that person come into your room, change the bed sheets, do all this kind of stuff. These are services that you can add on. You're effectively intensifying the use when you're going to HMO, but you can really intensify the use. Like what I've seen done is the downstairs living room is converted into an apartment type thing where you'll have an ensuite and you'll have a good generous sized room, like a double room. And then sometimes you'll be able to extend out to the rear. And so instead of having your dining kitchen area, you extend out to the rear and you end up with maybe two additional bedrooms that are stretching out into the back garden. Now you'll need planning permission for that kind of thing, but you can suddenly go from having a 4-bed to having a 7-bed just by doing that. And if you're able to use the roof attic space, if it's high enough attic, maybe you can go and have an 8-bed. And so all of this is important. And then finally, one of the ways that I'm seeing work, and I've said this probably before, is instead of managing the property as 8, let's say it's an 8-bed HMO, instead of trying to manage 8 separate people, what you do is you go and look for a corporate that is, like we'll say, a building contractor that's gotten a job working for a tech company, and they're going to be with them for the next 18 months doing a job with them. And that guy is probably looking for staffing accommodation because he's going to need to bring in a whole load of guys to work on this project. And so you go and rent the property to them. They take it as the HMO. So it's 8 rooms times 750 a month, and he will pay you that amount. And then in addition to that, the contractor takes on the electricity bills and whatever other bills and stuff like that. So he's taking on all the utilities, and he's taking on the house in its usage. And so you're just collecting a rent check every month or every quarter, and that's very profitable because typically speaking, the bills and the utilities are in your name, and so you're paying the bills and it's being deducted from your rental income. Now let's talk about, we can't really talk about profitability and stuff without talking about tax implications, and this is an important one. And if we talk about maximizing returns, we need to think about the difference between a lease and a license. And there's quite a big difference here. And this is a nuance that it's important nuance, okay? So the big question I get is from people saying, is it not like a lot of hassle? Is the reason that the market is emptying out of landlords down to the fact that you have to register with the RTB? And you've got rent pressure zones and all this kind of stuff where you can hardly increase your rent at all. And so there is a way around some of this, and that is instead of entering into a lease with your tenant, you enter into a license with your licensee. And just to kind of clarify the difference, a lease is a tenancy agreement, and it grants exclusive possession of the property to the tenant for a specified period. And this is in effect creating a legal interest in the property, and the tenant has total control over that, over who enters, and that includes the landlord. Like you as the landlord, you cannot go into that property without advance notice and permission from the tenant. A license is different. A license is simply permission to occupy the accommodation. It does not grant you exclusive possession. And so the landlord can enter at will. And I've seen actually videos online over in the UK and stuff, and it's basically, and I know this chap, but I won't mention his name, but I've seen videos of him knocking on the door saying, "Landlord's here, I'm coming in now, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, opening the door," and it smells weed in the room. The guy's been smoking or whatever, and no smoking allowed in this room. I'm giving you your notice, kind of a thing, and that would not be permitted under a lease. In a lease, you have complete control. Landlord cannot enter without advance notice. In the case of a license, it's kind of like you're a guest staying at the house, and you can have your license revoked at pretty short notice. We'll say you might give the person a month's notice and say, right, I'm giving you 30 days notice, you're out. Whereas under the lease terms now, people have, like, if they've been there a certain period of time, you have to give them 6 months notice before they can leave. Now, the objective here is not to be a dick about it. Like, we're not here to be, kind of little dictators that are like, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. But we've seen a lot of situations where a tenant is taking clear advantage of the landlord. And in the case where this is happening, I've seen situations where the landlord's had enough and they say, oh, you know what, I have to kind of sell this property or just get rid of this tenant or whatever. And then the RTB steps in and says the tenant can wait until the decision is made from them. That can take like 18 months. And meanwhile, they stop paying you the rent. And there's all of this stuff. And so a lot of people are just saying, I cannot go into this business if I have to register with the RTB because there's all these mandatory rules and stuff like that. So the license is something that allows you to kind of sidestep a number of those rules. But you don't want to do it in the form of being kind of like, oh, I'm smarter than you, I've outsmarted the system. You're really doing it just to protect yourself. And like the license is akin to a guest agreement, short-term arrangement, similar to what they have in student accommodation. Similar, when you stay in a hotel for the night, you're not signing a lease. You're just like staying the night, but that is under the license agreement effectively. You have the right to quiet enjoyment of the space for the duration of your stay, but it can be revoked if you're breaking the rules, and you're not getting a legal interest in the property or in the land. And so that's an important distinction. And it also doesn't give you the right to that particular room. And one of the ways that the license system works is that you're giving somebody a room in the house. You're not giving them a specific room in the house. So you're saying, yes, you will be granted a room in the house with an ensuite. And you're not saying, though, I'm going to be taking room 1A or 1B. That would mean that that person has a specific room that they've leased. But it's not like that. It's basically, no, we can move you to another room after a period of time if we desire. And you may not do that in practice, but that's what's permitted under the terms of the license. Now, it sounds great, doesn't it? Like, why not put everything into a license? Well, it does come with some taxation issues. And this is something that we need to think about, because you got to weigh up, as always, and I've said this before, you got to weigh up legal and tax are different areas and they have different pros and cons attached to them. So it's like my old story going back to the crash when you're in partnerships with people. Why did you go into a partnership with someone? Well, because the tax advice was to go into partnership. But then when your business partner goes bankrupt, you're lumped with their loan as well as yours. And so you've now inherited like double the debt. And so suddenly you're like, why did I sign that? I signed it because of tax advice. But the legal advice would have always been to enter into a separate agreement, not to have joint and several, and all that. So the same thing comes in this case around the HMO and stuff, because if you want to claim back interest on your loan, then you need to register the property with the RTB. You're not, like when you're applying for interest relief on a loan against your income, they'll only do it if it's registered with the RTB, as far as I know. So that's the first thing. The second thing is licensed income is not rental income. Licensed income is effectively trading income. And so trading income comes with some advantages and some disadvantages. The first advantage, I guess, is that if it's inside of a company, then the tax is lower. But if it's inside your personal name, then it's effectively the same. But where it's a very different is when trading income goes above a certain threshold, and that threshold is currently 40,000. It means that the income has now fallen into the VAT net. And so it means that you are now obligated to charge 13.5% VAT on what you're charging your tenant. And so it's effectively increasing the cost of the property to the tenant. And if you're, like, let's say you're charging 800 a month, and along comes the taxman and says, you now have to charge VAT on that. So you're saying, Jesus, that means that I'm going to have to pay 800 a month, or he's going to have to pay 800 a month plus 13.5%. That's nearly 900 a month. And why would he pay that when he can go down the road and get an 800 a month place? And so you end up absorbing the 13.5% effectively in order to keep your property competitive in the market. Now, one of the benefits of it, of course, is that you can claim back inputs. So if you go off to IKEA and buy a whole load of furniture and the furniture has VAT attached to it, well, you can deduct the VAT and you can actually claim all that stuff back. So there's pros and cons to it. VAT is not applicable in the case of a lease. So you don't get the VAT charged on a lease, so you kind of avoided that. Now, that's different in the case of, we'll say, commercial property. There is VAT, but not in the case of residential or accommodation. And one thing I will notice, or I will mention, and this is something that I have seen a couple of people thinking about when it comes to HMOs and stuff, but it can be applied to almost any kind of a rental. And that is I think they call it the ARP. And this is accommodation. I can't remember what the acronym is for, but it's effectively the payments made for Ukrainians staying in your property. And so what a few people have done is, we'll say they're renting out a HMO, and there might be, we'll say, the box room that you're not able to get a good price for, because if you're charging for a box room, the likelihood is you get a lower amount of rent. And if you're in the country, maybe you'd only be able to get like 550, 600 a month for that room. Well, if you actually put a Ukrainian into that room using the ARP system, that's 800 a month that you're entitled to. And it's not taxable. That's tax-free 800 a month. So that is quite a difference. Like if you're paying 52% tax on your income, then getting 800 a month tax-free is effectively like getting 1,600 rent. So that's an important thing to consider. And I've seen a few people holding back a room and instead doing the ARP. The other thing is, and this is not applicable to HMOs, but it is on, if you're renting out a room, there's a thing called the rent a room relief, and it's worth 14,000, and it is only on your home. You can only rent a room in your principal private residence. But again, that is a license agreement. That is not a lease that you're entering into with somebody. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is and we're, this is turning into a longer one. We're at 42 minutes now, but financing your HMO investment. When it comes to a HMO, there's a couple of scenarios. You're either an amateur or you're a professional. And I mentioned earlier the scenario of the amateur who just kind of converts the standard house into a HMO, starts renting it to more people. And in that case, you're not doing a lot. You're really just taking the property. It's a kind of like a little bit like just changing the name of the property. It's not invasive. You've not done a whole lot of work. And in this case, the extra money that you're getting in you will also have extra expenses and costs, because you're going to be taking on the utility bills that you didn't have before and things like that. And so that does increase the amount of expenses that you've got. So whether or not there's been a substantial increase in your income is debatable. A lot of people would think to themselves, well, I've got all this extra rent now, so this must make the property more valuable. But not necessarily. It doesn't do it on paper. You're still effectively, you've got a house that is, you haven't done much to it, and the bank valuer that comes along to look at it is not going to see much of a difference between the house before it was a HMO and after it's a HMO. Even if you're getting this extra income, it's going to be difficult to convince a bank valuer that the property has gone up in value itself. And so you're going to probably struggle to get an equity release or a refinance in that situation. However, when you go about it, the professional approach, we'll say, and this is, I'm going to take you through like an entire professional approach's the timeline. First of all, very careful selection of the property. I mentioned earlier, you're looking at the property, you're looking at, is it in a cul-de-sac? Is all this parking going to be a problem? Like you're taking that kind of thinking all the way back to the beginning. You're looking at it. Are you buying a property that's in really poor condition and there's room there for you to make substantial improvements? If you're buying a brand new house that's just been that's just been finished, there's going to be a lot of work that you're doing that perhaps is abortive work. Like you're taking in a perfectly good wall to go and put up another wall in a different location. Things like that can be problematic. Whereas if you're buying a house that, let's say, hasn't been lived in for quite a few years, and a typical example of that might be, let's say there's an elderly lady living in a house and she's decided it's time for her to move into a nursing home. What often happens in that situation is they do not sell the house because they don't they think that perhaps they'll be coming back to the house after the nursing home, but often that they never come back. And so the house ends up not lived in, but not sold. And so they live in the nursing home for the rest of their life. And that could be 10 or 12 years, and the property has sit there empty for 10 or 12 years. You come along, you see it, you're able to buy that property, It's in poor condition, it's very dated looking, and you're able to add substantial value by stripping out all of the internal partitions, installing like a new heating system. You're plumbing it to every room individually so that each room has its own separate, control around the heating system. You're putting in wired smoke detectors. You're putting in sensors on the windows. So if somebody opens the window, it switches off the heating system. If somebody is in the room, there's a little PIR up in the ceiling and it's telling you that, yeah, the person's in the room, the heat can stay on. But as soon as they go out, it switches off and things like that. That's a very professional approach to it. And by doing that, your bills are going to be under better control and stuff like that. But also, you've got a lot of stuff that you can demonstrate to a valuer that you've done that makes it a specific HMO. And like, for example, all the rooms are now ensuite, all well appointed. There's no obvious room that's like the box room that nobody wants. They're all the same. You've extended out the rear perhaps. You've maybe added 2 bedrooms out the back, ensuite as well. And you've increased the size of the property from maybe a 4-bed up to a 7 or an 8-bed. Now you're renting to a corporate and they take over the utility bills. And then they're paying the rate per room plus all the utility bills. Like, that's a massive increase. Now, it does likely trigger the VAT we talked about, but a lot of the time corporates are VAT registered, so it's not an issue for them either. Now, when you go to look to refinance that, the bank's valuer is coming out. You show them around, you show all the specific features that you added, you show the quality of the finishes and everything like that. You might have some before and after photos, but in addition to that, you're going to show them evidence of higher values achieved in the area. So remember, you bought this property and it was a dated home that hasn't been lived in for 12 years. So you bought it for maybe 300 grand, but there's evidence on that street of properties going for 550 or 600 grand. And so you got something really at a good value. And there's houses that are, in good condition going for much, much higher. So now you have evidence that this higher price is achievable in the area. That's what the valuer is looking for, to convince him that, yes, the property has gone up substantially in value. All the work you've done, you might have spent 120 grand, 150 grand, but you've actually added value to the property in the region of 250, maybe 300 grand. So you're looking at a substantial increase above and beyond the money that was spent on the property. And so when you go to release any kind of equity or something like that, you're going to suddenly find that you can actually get almost all of your money back out of a refinance. So you get back your original deposit and you get back a substantial lump of that money that you spent doing up the property. Now, the banks can be difficult, even though a valuer might come along and say, yep, it's worth 600 grand, and they give you a piece of paper saying it's worth 600 grand. Banks can still be a little bit difficult. They don't really consider the rent that you're getting. If you're getting like 6-7 grand a month and everyone else on the street's getting 2.5-3 grand a month, you might think, look, I'm doing much better. I can support a loan. I can do this. A lot of the big banks like Bank of Ireland and AIB and stuff, they don't tend to look at HMO as a separate entity to a standard rent. And so they'll just apply the same rules. Now, ICS, that is one of the lenders that are doing it differently. And I've been hearing different stories from different clients that are working with them. They're more expensive. They charge, like, instead of charging 5%, they might be charged 7%. But it's based on the rental income of the property. And so if you're getting 6 or 7 grand, you can get a much bigger loan from ICS than you would from maybe some of the other lenders. So there's a lot of figures here that you have to kind of juggle, all the different tax rates and the VAT and whether or not you're claiming back the interest on your loan, all of that stuff. You have to put that into a spreadsheet. And maybe you're listening, you're like, geez, I have no clue how to do those kind of spreadsheets and stuff. That's stuff that I do teach inside of my accelerator. And as I mentioned on last week's call, I think, there is a new cohort for my accelerator launching in October. There are spots available, and I have the in-person event next Saturday the 5th. And so if you're listening to this the week that I'm launching this podcast or releasing this podcast, there's still available spots. So reach out to me and I'll let you know any further details that you're missing out on. But this is a key skill: buying well, refurbishing efficiently, and adding substantial value knowing that there's evidence there that will allow you to extract it and go again in the next project that you look at. And finally, talking about the exit strategy. If you're going to sell the property, you need to go through those same steps. And it's the very same reason. Like, if you don't have comparable evidence for your valuer, then somebody's going to come along, is going to look at the property, say, I'd like to buy this property from you. They're going to go off and they're going to talk to a bank, and the bank are going to say, okay, we'll send our valuer. And unless you're arming that purchaser with the same information that you use to get your refi, there's a good chance that they won't be able to get the money to buy the property at the rate that you're selling it. And so that's why it's important. Build up the evidence, get all the proof, and have maybe a little kind of document that sort of shows, look, this is what we've done to it. Here's all the features, because it's different to what you're doing in a standard house. The fact that you've plumbed the central heating back to each room separately, that is not standard. Like, that is a really valuable change in the systems to lower the utility bills. One of the big problems that people have in HMO rental is you're renting rooms, let's say you're renting rooms to 6 people. 6 people that are not paying the electricity bills themselves. And so 6 people you'll often visit a person's house or visit somebody in their house, and they're all walking around in t-shirts, and yet the windows are wide open, and yet the heating is on full blast. That's because nobody's paying the bill. The landlord is picking up the bill. And I know from speaking with some of my clients that $2,000 a month in electricity bills and stuff, not unusual. And that's because nobody's paying the bill. They don't give a damn, and they'll just lash it all on full time. And if they're feeling too hot, don't turn off the central heating, just open the windows. Leave the central heating on. Anyway, the ideal scenario, like selling the property and all that kind of stuff, if you've managed to go and do a HMO and you're getting all this additional income, like, my personal strategy would be to hold on to it, because it's worth a lot of money having a portfolio producing a nice income like that. And if you can just plow all of your surplus cash into, well, put some money aside for the sinking fund, as I mentioned, but plow it all into paying down the debt, you get that property debt free very quickly. And meanwhile, you're rolling on to another deal and you're doing the same. You start to build a really solid, robust rental income that's coming in every month. And as you build it up, you end up with multiple properties. And so you could have a portfolio of 10 of these. Imagine if you have 10 of these properties, that's 70 grand a month, potentially 80,000 a month coming in. That's $1 million a year in income. And so you're starting to look like you're a person who can step away from the full-time job, or you've built enough passive income that you can kind of start looking at doing development work. If you're a contractor, you're not thinking about, I'll be working until I'm in the ground, basically. You'll actually have some time to sort of step back if you've built up the passive income. Now, one of the final things I'll say is I have been hearing recently quite a bit there's just rumors about firms coming in, big firms, and they're starting to buy up HMOs, and they're starting to buy up, like, assemble a portfolio of HMOs. And what some of these guys are is they're big firms that look after the data center construction and stuff. And what they want is a big accommodation portfolio, so that they can actually provide services for all of this, and they can actually have accommodation for their staffing. And one of the things to remember when you're talking about these big firms, they don't look at the property at its valuation. They look at the property from the point of view of how it fits into the narrative in their company. If they're a listed company on the stock market, a lot of the time they just having all those extra rooms gives them a higher valuation on the stock market. It's not actually related to, well, those properties are only worth $1 million, and therefore their shares can go up $1 million. No, maybe because they have so many rooms, that might put the valuation of their company up $5 million. Now, I saw that in the case of the big student accommodation players that came into the market around 2014, 2015. I was looking at doing property deals, and I was looking to make a nice developer's profit on deals. And it wasn't possible to make the profit once these guys stepped in, because they were just buying the property at the full value. They were saying, we'll buy the land and we'll just automatically assume the full value of this house or this unit at the end of the project. Whereas I was saying, no, I don't want to do that, because I need to have my developer's profit. They weren't looking for the developer's profit. They were just looking to build this big portfolio, because it increased the size of their share valuation in the stock market. So that's it, guys. Almost an hour of HMO investment advice. And I hope you found it useful. If you are interested in understanding more about my accelerator, please reach out to me. This is for the slightly more advanced people, so it's not for beginners, but it's definitely worth your while if you're interested in joining a bunch of guys that are doing this kind of stuff. It's the new cohort. Will be great to have you on board, and you can come to the in-person meeting and stuff like that. So look, guys, be sure to reach out if you are interested, and I'll talk to you next week. Take care. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Behind the Facade. If you enjoyed the show or found it in any way useful, could I please ask you to take a moment to leave a review over on iTunes or Spotify? This really helps us get the podcast out in front of more people. If you have any questions or topics you would like me to cover in future episodes, please connect with me via my brand new school community. You will find a link in the show notes. You can stay up to date with all of my content and the projects I'm working on by signing up for my weekly newsletter over on my website, gavinjgallagher.com. That's all for now. See you back here, same time next week.